Here is the Berlin Wall, an impenetrable border. Erected in 1961 by the German Democratic Republic, also known as East Germany. For nearly 30 years, the wall tore through the German capital, symbolizing the division between the capitalist and communist worlds. But on the evening of November 9, 1989, the wall fell. Excerpt. But how did we arrive at this historic evening, which for many marked the end of the Cold War? Because as I was preparing this episode, I realized that we actually know rather little about the Berlin Wall. Why did East Germany find itself forced to let its people tear down the wall without reacting? And, by the way, why was this wall built in the first place? How did it work? So many questions that I'll try to answer to understand that crazy evening of November 9, 1989. Get comfortable. Chapter 1, The War of Worlds. Alright, to understand it all, we need to go back a few years before the wall was built. In 1945, the war finally ended in Europe. But to destroy Hitler and the Nazis, it was necessary to devastate Germany. The country was nothing but a field of ruins, an indescribable chaos where the victors over Nazism divided what remained of the Third Reich. In line with agreements made among the Allies, what was left of the Reich was divided into 4 occupation zones: an American, French, and British zone in the west, and a Soviet zone in the east. As for Berlin, even though it was in the heart of the Soviet zone, it too was divided into 4 occupation zones. The Soviet army vacated the western part of the city to allow the Western troops to settle in. And this small slice of the free world would make Berlin one of the hottest points of the Cold War. While in the West, with significant support from the United States and its Marshall Plan, Germany quickly rebuilt, and its economy developed at breakneck speed, it was a bit more complicated in the East. The Soviet zone rebuilt more slowly because the destruction was more extensive, and much of the production was sent directly to the Soviet Union. And that's not to mention the fact that the population struggled with the forced implementation of communism. So it's no surprise that many sought to flee to the West for a better life. The problem was that a true Iron Curtain, as Churchill called it, had descended on Europe after the war, and crossing into the West through the border dividing the two Germanys had become nearly impossible. The only way to get to the West was in Berlin. At that time, although divided between East and West, everyone could cross from one side to the other without any problems, and the two Berlins were even connected by subway lines. To leave the Soviet zone, one only had to go to West Berlin, from where they could reach the West by train, plane, or 3 special highways. And since no one could stop them, tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of people fled to the West. And there was one man who didn't like this at all: Stalin. In June 1948, Berlin was hit by the first major crisis of the Cold War, when Stalin imposed a blockade on West Berlin, cutting off all access to and from the city. But still no wall. The Soviet army merely blocked the roads and encircled the city. The blockade then raised fears among West Berliners of starving or freezing with winter approaching. But despite the blockade that stifled the city, Berlin would hold out for almost a year thanks to a massive airlift that supplied it with food and coal. In total, 2.5 million tons of food and coal were dropped on Berlin. After almost a year of blockade, Stalin was forced to admit defeat and lifted the blockade on May 1, 1949. The same year, the occupation zones were replaced by 2 states. In the West, the Federal Republic of Germany, or FRG, and in the East, the German Democratic Republic, or GDR, a communist country under Soviet influence. The two countries then followed very different paths. With the Cold War, it was now 2 worlds clashing: liberalism versus communism. While the FRG continued to develop, the GDR struggled to catch up. It was a dictatorship led by the SED, the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, communists who followed Moscow's directives. And Berlin? Well, as with the rest of Germany, Berlin's occupation zones disappeared, leaving a city divided in 2. East Berlin attached to the GDR and West Berlin, now an enclave of the FRG. From that point on, it was clear to the Soviet Union and the East German government that West Berlin posed a serious problem because, unsurprisingly, people would continue to flee. In the following years, thousands of East Germans continued to flee, many of whom were skilled engineers or workers. At this rate, soon there would be no one left in the GDR to rebuild the country. Between 1949 and 1960, about 3 million East Germans moved westward, Out of an initial population of just 18 million, that was colossal. 55 in FRG. The communist leaders had to find a solution, and this is where Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, came in. In 1958, he issued an ultimatum to the West, demanding that Western troops leave West Berlin. Not surprisingly, however, the Americans refused to leave, and West Berliners had no desire to live under a dictatorship. Despite 2 summits in Geneva and Paris between the Soviets, Americans, British, and French, no solution was found. Notably, neither the FRG nor the GDR had a say, highlighting how they were merely pawns in a conflict that was beyond them. The election of President Kennedy in 1961 only intensified matters. He declared that the United States would defend West Berlin at all costs, raising concerns about a potential Third World War starting in Berlin. Fortunately, Khrushchev wanted to avoid war with NATO. Nevertheless, there was growing sentiment that it was time to definitively resolve the issue of West Berlin, which was a thorn in the side of the GDR. Officially, East German leader Walter Ulbricht claimed he had no intention of erecting a physical border to contain West Berlin. Excerpt. But behind the scenes, the opposite was happening. In fact, Ulbricht had long been seeking Khrushchev's approval to build a wall. Wishing to settle the Berlin problem, Khrushchev took advantage of Kennedy's weakened position following the Bay of Pigs invasion to take matters into his own hands and grant Ulbricht's request. If he couldn't take over West Berlin, he could at least cut it off from the world. On the night of August 12 to 13, 1961, West Berlin was suddenly surrounded by 155 kilometers of barbed wire. Overnight, no one could cross the boundary between East and West. Families and friends were separated, and some children could no longer attend school, while adults couldn't reach their workplaces. The subway lines that connected both parts of the city were quickly closed off, and orders were given to shoot anyone trying to cross to the other side. Suddenly, the term Iron Curtain, which had divided the Western Bloc from the Eastern Bloc since 1945, took on a very concrete meaning. Chapter 2, The Wall. It quickly became evident that this wall was not just a wall. It was a barrier, a trench between 2 worlds. At first, it was merely a line of barbed wire with a few concrete blocks surrounding West Berlin, which many didn't hesitate to jump over in the first few days. But in the following weeks and months, the barbed wire was replaced with more concrete blocks, and a true wall began to take shape. Stretching 155 kilometers, it encircled West Berlin, leaving only a handful of crossing points, like the famous Checkpoint Charlie, allowing a few people, such as diplomats, to pass to the other side. The decision to build the wall immediately heightened the already tense relations between East and West. West Berlin's mayor, Willy Brandt, condemned what he called the Wall of Shame, even comparing it to concentration camp fences. The American troops stationed in West Berlin suddenly found themselves enclosed, and the tensions escalated. But Kennedy categorically refused to abandon West Berlin. The crisis reached its peak on October 27, 1961, at Checkpoint Charlie, when East German guards refused entry to an American diplomat attempting to cross into East Berlin. The situation escalated to the point where American and Soviet tanks were deployed, facing off for 24 hours before finally withdrawing without a single shot being fired. Clearly, World War III would not start in Berlin. The Americans understood that Khrushchev wasn't looking for war and didn't want to force the Americans to leave Berlin. In fact, the wall, imperfect as it was, allowed the problem of West Berlin to be frozen in place. Tensions eased, though issues re-emerged throughout the Cold War, like during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 and the Euro Missile Crisis in the 1970s and 1980s. Berlin became a vast playground for intelligence services from both blocs during these years. But ultimately, the feared war never took place, and that was certainly for the best. Still, this wall of shame would continue to divide Berlin for many years. Now, we're in the 1980s. Since the 1960s, East Germany had largely caught up, becoming the foremost power in the communist bloc alongside the Soviet Union. The GDR, especially East Berlin, had become a showcase for socialism. Everyone lived in identical apartment blocks. Sports and culture were promoted, education and healthcare were free and widely accessible, and unemployment was nearly non-existent. This explains why some people look back on this period with a sense of nostalgia for the East, or nostalgia. when life felt simpler. But that was just the good side of the GDR. East Germany was still a dictatorship, without democracy or freedom of speech, and its people were closely monitored by the feared Stasi, the East German secret police, rumored to have eavesdropped on nearly everyone. The population had to deal with shortages, and despite the apparent equality, many privileges were granted to important members of the party. The GDR also became one of the most militarized countries in the Eastern Bloc because, if the West attacked, East Germany would be on the front line. And the wall, it was still there, though it had evolved quite a bit by this time. This wall, as I've realized, is a bit challenging to picture because it obviously changed a lot between the 1960s and the 1980s. It went from barbed wire to concrete walls, eventually becoming two walls starting in the 1970s. It's also worth noting that, over its 155 kilometers, not every part was identical. But here's an example of what the wall might have looked like at its peak in 1983. The image we have of the wall with its graffiti is actually of the west side. But what did it look like from the east? Here's what you would have faced if you were an East Berliner trying to cross over. Before even reaching the wall, all buildings overlooking it had been emptied of residents, and the windows were bricked up to prevent any risk of spying. The wall itself began with a concrete wall. Beyond that, a no-man's land several meters wide separated the wall from an electric fence that triggered an alarm if touched. Behind this was a row of metal spikes to injure anyone daring enough to get that far. Next, you'd face the wall's defenders, the Grenztruppen, the GDR border troops. The entire zone was patrolled by foot or by vehicle, some with guard dogs trained to attack escapees. The wall was equipped with about 300 watchtowers and 90 observation posts, where soldiers were ordered to shoot on sight anyone attempting to cross. If you made it this far, congratulations, you were halfway there. Next came another no-man's land, known as the Death Strip, illuminated by floodlights and covered in sand, making it impossible to cross without leaving footprints. Some areas were also rigged with anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, and occasionally there were trenches with Czech hedgehogs, designed to prevent vehicle advancement if NATO attempted to breach the wall by force. Finally, the last barrier before West Berlin, a massive 3.6-meter-high concrete wall. Its surface was intentionally smooth, and its top edge was rounded to prevent climbing. Despite how intimidating it might seem, there were many attempts to cross the wall. Many managed to climb over and cross the no-man's land while evading the guards. Others used more creative methods like digging tunnels, hiding in car trunks, or even crossing by air in ultralights or hot air balloons, or swimming across the Spree River, which flows through Berlin. Between 1961 and 1989, about 5,000 East Germans managed to make it to the west, but many were not so lucky. Like Ida Siekmann, the wall's first victim, who died while jumping from her apartment, or Peter Fechter, whose death shocked the public. Shot as he attempted to cross the wall, he fell into the death strip, where the guards left him to bleed to death for an hour in front of onlookers. And there was Winfried Freudenberg, the wall's last victim, who died from the cold in the homemade air balloon he used to try and escape. We still don't know exactly how many people lost their lives trying to flee the GDR, though estimates today place the number around 588. I took some time to set this context as it seemed important, at least for me personally, to really understand what the wall meant, what it was like to have a city split in two and be unable to leave. Regardless, the decision to erect the wall will always be remembered as an admission of weakness by Khrushchev, symbolizing the failure of the communist model the USSR was trying to impose on the GDR since 1949, which had driven its people to flee. President Kennedy reminded us of this during his visit to Berlin on June 26, 1963. Aside from his famous Ich bin ein Berliner, he also took a jab at the communist regimes. Our democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep our people in. Despite criticisms and various periods of both détente and tension throughout the Cold War, no serious consideration was ever given to bringing down the wall. Never until the arrival of a new man in the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev. Chapter 3: The Fracture. When Gorbachev took over the Soviet Union in 1985, the USSR was already facing a deep crisis that had been worsening for years. Since the 1970s, its economy had stagnated, its population suffered from constant shortages, And at the same time, military spending skyrocketed with the Soviet Army's entanglement in Afghanistan and the resurgence of an arms race with the United States, which drained the USSR. The Soviet government had no choice but to initiate reforms. To do this, Gorbachev fundamentally transformed the USSR from within, first with economic and social reforms through perestroika, and a promise of greater freedom of expression through glasnost. Externally, the USSR's stance toward other communist countries also shifted, with these countries partly losing Soviet support but gaining more independence in return. In short, he believed communist nations should reform themselves, and the Soviets should focus on their own country as a priority. Finally, Gorbachev moved to foster relations with the West, particularly with the United States. The Iron Curtain dividing Europe began to fray, and people started to imagine that it could eventually become just another border. In 1988, President Reagan, who played a key role in the USSR's collapse by supporting the Afghan Mujahideen, used this moment to provoke his Soviet counterpart, challenging him to tear down this wall. The year 1989 would change everything. The reforms in the Soviet Union inspired other communist countries, such as Poland, which in June became the first communist bloc country to hold elections allowing other parties to participate. A wind of freedom swept through the communist bloc. In August, Hungary became the first country to crack the Iron Curtain by opening its border with Austria. It was the height of summer, and 660 East Germans on vacation took advantage of this opening to cross to the west. But soon the news spread, and now more than 200,000 GDR citizens flocked to the Hungarian border to cross into Austria, with 50,000 succeeding. Soon after, Czechoslovakia also dismantled the Iron Curtain and opened its border with West Germany. The communist regimes imposed by force at the end of the war were crumbling, and with the USSR weakened, people no longer feared the arrival of Soviet tanks to restore order as they did during the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Meanwhile, in Germany, East German leader Erich Honecker grew increasingly anxious about the renewed exodus of East Germans. Moreover, he was not pleased with Gorbachev's rapprochement with the West, including West Germany, knowing that his regime was growing increasingly fragile. For a decade, the East German economy had stagnated. The country was no longer producing enough and was struggling to innovate, coupled with the population's frustration with authoritarianism, the omnipresence of the Stasi, and the government's refusal to implement reforms. East Germans naturally began to demand change. Even though people couldn't cross to the West without permission, the country wasn't completely isolated from the world. East Germany wasn't North Korea. People knew what was happening beyond the Iron Curtain. They had family there, and they received West German radio and television. Consequently, they were well aware of East Germany's dire economic situation, while West Germany had managed to become a European powerhouse. Because, yes, in 1989, the GDR was heavily in debt and on the brink of bankruptcy, a fact that had even been hidden from the upper echelons of government. And now, with the Soviet Union's diminished threat, the idea of changing the system began to take root. In September, the first opposition groups began to form within Protestant churches. The churches provided a space because, with a certain level of autonomy in the GDR, people could gather there without fear of arrest. Together, they formed a movement called the New Forum, which quickly grew. So, on October 7th, when the GDR celebrated its 40th anniversary in grand style, Gorbachev, visiting Berlin for the occasion, subtly made it clear to Honecker that he would not support the East German regime in case of a revolution. Here's what he said to the press. Yes, things were starting to go sour. Naturally, Gorbachev's comments fueled the movement. Throughout October, a wave of protests swept across the GDR, with gatherings held every Monday in Leipzig, attracting more and more people without the Stasi being able to intervene. Within 3 weeks, attendance soared from 70,000 to 300,000 protesters. However, Honecker refused to acknowledge the crisis or undertake any reforms, choosing instead to ignore it and dismiss the uprising as Western propaganda. Still in denial, Stasi head Erich Mielke also chose to ignore the warnings from his agents about the high risk of a popular insurrection. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, U.S. President Bush put pressure on the GDR government by declaring that Berlin should be the next to open its border. Let Berlin be next. Yet, once again, Honecker refused to admit East Germany was in crisis. For him, it was still inconceivable to loosen his grip by offering more freedom to his people. In fact, he did the opposite. To curb the ever-increasing flow of East Germans fleeing the GDR, he decided in early October to impose a visa requirement on citizens wanting to leave the country, even to travel to other communist bloc countries. In other words, no one could leave the country without authorization. As you might guess, this measure only intensified the anger. Protests continued. Despite fierce repression from the police and the Stasi, nothing seemed capable of halting the movement. On October 9th, Honecker threatened a Chinese-style response, referring to the Tiananmen Square protests that had recently been violently crushed in Beijing. To do this, he asked for the support of the Soviet army stationed in the GDR, but Gorbachev refused to intervene. Cornered, Honecker was ousted by the Politburo on October 18th after 18 years in power. His replacement, Egon Krenz, attempted to calm the situation by announcing economic reforms. But at that moment, it's important to understand that no one was considering opening the borders, dismantling the wall, or even less, the disappearance of the GDR. But it was already too late. On November 4th, 1 million East Germans demonstrated in the streets of East Berlin, where, for the first time, they were joined by dissidents from the Communist Party. It was the largest protest organized against the regime. Shortly after, several ministers and high-ranking officials resigned. With his back against the wall, Krenz decided it was time to follow Hungary and Czechoslovakia. It was time to open the border between East and West. Chapter 4: The Fall. It's the morning of November 9th, 1989. That day, a meeting took place with Krenz and the rest of the new Politburo that had succeeded Honecker. The agenda was initially to discuss opening the border between the GDR and Czechoslovakia, but soon the discussion led the Politburo to make a far more radical decision. By the end of the meeting, they had agreed to allow any East German citizen with a passport and visa to leave the GDR without restriction, including to go to the West. The measure was supposed to go into effect the next day, so they decided to hold a press conference that evening to announce the decision. But nothing would go as planned. At 6:53 p.m. on November 9th, Gunter Schabowski, the Central Committee spokesperson, faced a room packed with journalists. The problem was, he hadn't attended that morning's meeting and had only received a document summarizing the new regulations at the last minute. During the press conference, he made several announcements, including the decision to open the GDR's borders. Initially, the announcement seemed so momentous that he was asked to repeat it, but that wasn't the worst part. Shortly after, two journalists, one Italian and one American, asked him, "All right, so the border will be opened. But when exactly?" This is where he made a major mistake. Live on TV, Schabowski, who had not attended the meeting where the decision was made and had been left to face the press without time to read the file he held in his hands, replied, "As far as I know, immediately." This unexpected announcement had the effect of a bombshell. In his notes, it was clearly stated that the borders would open from November 10th, the next day, but Schabowski hadn't read it. Within minutes, news spread across Germany and reached Western capitals. The GDR opens its borders. The media in West Germany, which had a wide audience in the East, picked up the story. Barely 2 hours after Schabowski's announcement, thousands of East Berliners rushed to the wall. Faced with an ever-growing crowd, the border guards were overwhelmed, especially since they hadn't received any orders because their superiors simply hadn't been informed of the decision to open the border. At 11:30 p.m., Harald Jaeger, head of the Bornholmerstrasse checkpoint, gave up trying to control the crowd and ordered the checkpoint to be opened. Within minutes, his colleagues did the same at other checkpoints along the wall. Instantly, a huge crowd surged into the no-man's land that had divided Berlin for 28 years. Chaos and confusion mixed with the joy of Berliners who could finally reunite. People climbed the wall, popped champagne, and celebrated for days. It had taken one night to build the wall, and it took only one night to bring it down. In the following days, people came with their picks and sledgehammers to break off pieces of the wall, either as a piece of history to keep or as a lucrative tourist souvenir. Later, bulldozers finished the job of bringing down the wall of shame. For many at the time, the fall of the wall felt like an inevitable event, as if it were part of the course of history. But analyzing an event this way is a very human yet simplistic view. As we've seen, the reality is much more complex. A whole context preceded the fall of the wall. The long decline of the USSR, Gorbachev's policy of openness in the Soviet Union, the months of protests shaking the GDR, tensions in other Eastern countries, and sometimes even a blunder on live TV. The East German uprising greatly benefited from Gorbachev's reluctance to intervene, a position that Stalin certainly wouldn't have taken. With Stalin, it would have been resolved differently, with a heavy-handed use of Red Army tanks, and the outcome would have been very different. Within a week, 4 million East Germans crossed into the West. What happened in Berlin quickly inspired all the peoples under communist regimes in Europe. In Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania, all the Soviet Union's satellite regimes fell one after another. But the GDR itself still remained, though in a dire state, and everyone knew it wouldn't last long in its current form unless urgently reformed. This marked the beginning of the complex question of reunification between East and West Germany. Although it was expected to take years, German reunification would ultimately be decided in just a few months. Chapter 5: Reunification. When the wall fell, the Americans unsurprisingly celebrated this event, seeing it as further confirmation of the Cold War's end. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl was determined to reunite Germany as quickly as possible. On November 28th, just days after the wall fell, he presented a 10-step reunification plan to the West German parliament. But he was quickly reminded not to rush ahead, as France and the United Kingdom were less enthusiastic about the fall of the wall. In the UK, Margaret Thatcher feared that if Germany reunified, it might return to old habits like nationalism, which had already led to 2 world wars. In her view, the GDR should reform and become a democracy but remain independent. In France, President Mitterrand was somewhat more nuanced. He was open to reunification but feared that a unified Germany might become an economic giant, surpassing France, which was then Europe's leading power. Spoiler, that's more or less what happened. And finally, we almost forgot, but what did the Soviets think? Yes, the Red Army was still stationed in the GDR, and Gorbachev could, in theory, press the red button to send his tanks charging into Berlin. However, the USSR was in such a state, with Soviet republics like Moldova and Georgia seeking independence, that Gorbachev was unable to manage the situation in the GDR. Since the Germans, the French, and the Americans were certain that the Soviet Union wouldn't intervene, everything moved very quickly. In early 1990, Hans Madro, who had just succeeded Egon Krenz and would be the last leader of the GDR, decided that the SED would no longer be the sole ruling party. In March, private property was restored, and the communists were defeated in the legislative elections. On August 22nd, East and West Berlin united, and on the same day, the GDR parliament voted to dissolve itself without even seeking approval from the FRG. Then, on September 12th, a treaty was signed in Moscow for the withdrawal of Soviet troops from the GDR. This paved the way for German reunification, which officially took place on October 3, 1990. The German Democratic Republic disappeared after 41 years, absorbed into another Germany. A year later, overcome by crises and divisions, the Soviet Union collapsed and was officially dissolved on December 26, 1991. The Cold War was over.